Okay, so good evening, and this is the YouTube on restoration and conservation. And I'm going to go through a few different topics, a bit about the history of restoration ecology as a science, ecological theory and systems, some philosophical meanderings that the restoration ecologists seem to be going through, talk a bit about the relationship between conservation and restoration, link it briefly to species restoration through the form of translocation, and then end with a bit of climate change. Just for your edification, while just doodling around on conservation and restoration, I found this thing called the Khan Academy. They do these crash course things. This is a 9-minute video on conservation and restoration. As you can see, I was about halfway through it when I got done and took this video shot. But it talks a bit about what conservation and restoration can do for helping the earth. It's actually kind of an interesting thing, but you can look at it if you want. So, of course, restoration ecology is its own science with its own society, and here's the Society for Ecological Restoration's mission. Across the globe, centuries of unsustainable activities have damaged aquatic, marine, and terrestrial environments, and that SER is dedicated to reversing this degradation, restoring the Earth's ecological balance. And so there have been books out now for about 30 years, that this is emerging right about the same time as conservation biology is as a field. And the first book I knew about was this book edited by Jordan Gilpin and Aber, Restoration Ecology, a Synthetic Approach to Ecological Research. And in this book, Anthony Bradshaw in 1987 says, restoration is the acid test for ecological theory. That if we can reassemble disassembled systems, then we really understand what's going on in a system, and that was his philosophical approach. Subsequently, in the early 2000s, there's handbooks of restorations, principles of restoration, restoration in practice. There's books and books and books on this. But what this is a figure in the middle is also from Anthony Bradshaw, and it's trying to capture the essence of restoration ecology, that we have ecosystem structure here on the x-axis, species and the complexity of species, and ecosystem function, nutrient cycling, nutrient content, biomass on the y-axis, and that a degraded system has a reduced function and a simplified structure, and that through the process of primary succession, you move along this trajectory to some sort of intact ecosystem or original ecosystem after it's been degraded and disturbed, and that and the act of restoration is pushing sites along that boundary. There are some R words on this slide that are also useful to think about in restoration ecology. Restoration ecologists often segregate the idea of restoration from rehabilitation from reclamation, from one from another rather. So that reclamation is taking a site de novo and making it back into a system as if, say, for example, mine tailings or a mine pit, whereas rehabilitation and restoration may be taking something that's degraded, and we also talk about refurbishing and other words. So there's a whole technical science here. If you look at what are the most cited papers on restoration ecology, some of the things that we'll be talking about in class, and I'm not going to talk about them here: novel ecosystems, alternative states, stable states, and positive feedbacks. I'll talk about that briefly because I've forgotten whether our team is going to talk about that or not. Hobbes and Norton towards a conceptual framework for restoration ecology. Again, we'll be talking about that in class, so I won't deal with that here. But one of the things that Suding and et al. Did in their paper, that's I guess it's from, what year is it? That's 2004. They made a couple of points that I think are important to capture. Is that if you look at the graph on the photo montage on the left, pristine, degraded, restoration, restored, you note that in columns A, B, and C, that you can be restoring either through restoring structure or through function, like using fire to restore a system. And so that they make the point that restoration actions can take either kind of form. And the other thing that's critical about this particular paper was that it brought up this idea of alternate stable state. So this idea had been in the ecological literature with respect to, say, things like the prairie forest border, where people suggested that the ecosystems had an amount of rainfall that might support either forests or prairies, and it really all just depended on whether the area was burned frequently or not. Sooting and all have conceptualized this in this figure to the right, A and B, where you might have some gradient and environmental condition across the x-axis, and that you have some system state value on the y-axis, and that there might be some significant zone of overlap where it could either be in state 1 or state 2, and that you move system along that gradient through a degradation process, and that you can have ecosystem collapse as shown on the right, and that this might make recovery particularly difficult. It's not just as simple as like restoring fire into a prairie. Okay, so and of course restoring function so one of the principal precepts of restoration ecology is that restoring functions can help restore the composition, and that and vice versa. So these are two pictures, one from Maine where there's a dam removal, and the idea basically is that remove the dam and you get back all of the native species, or most of the native species, as you restore the function as a continuous river. The Kissimmee River in Florida, a very highly engineered river drainage and one of the most expensive ecosystem restoration projects on Earth, was to put the meanders back in the Kissimmee River, as you can see in those pictures in the lower in the bottom of the slide. So, as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of books out there, but restoration ecologists, like a lot of conservation biologists, are also going through this existential angst. So Andre Kluel was a guy at the University of Florida who retired early in his career to start a restoration company, and he wrote a book, Ecological Restoration Principles, Values, and Structure of an Emerging Profession. So thinking about what are the values that are driving the system. William Jordan, who is the author of that book on ecological principles of restoration with the little jigsaw puzzle pieces, he's written several books now: Making Nature Whole, The Sunflower Forest, Ecological Restoration, and The New Communion with Nature. So he's really thinking about people's interaction with nature and interacting with nature through the restoration process. A little bit different sort of thing than he started out his career as. So, and then down at the bottom, The Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, Emma Marison, thinking about both conservation and restoration in a place where there's lots of degradation. So a couple of papers that I think really frame restoration with respect to conservation well are done by Truman Young. And so this is a paper in 2005 in Ecology Letters, The Ecology of Restoration, Historical Links, Emerging Issues, and Unexplored Realms. And this is a table from that paper where he's basically saying there are many established ecological concepts that are understood and used by restoration practitioners. And the idea of competition and niches, regeneration niches, that there's succession or change in predictable change in communities through time, that there can be facilitation, and that you can use facilitation within a restoration process. And so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it does, yeah, anyway, I'll just leave that there. Earlier, Truman wrote this paper for biological conservation called Restoration and Conservation Biology. So it's in a conservation biology journal, and he's making several points that I'd like to highlight here. First off, up in the upper right, he's done this before, other people have done this, showed that really late 80s to early 90s you have an explosion in the literature, and you have the formation of societies and journals and textbooks that come out. But in this, I think what is really valuable about this paper is he contrasts sort of conservation biology and restoration ecology thinking. So here's a mindset that in conservation biology we think of losses as permanent, whereas restoration we think of them as something that has a long-term recovery cycle. and that the dominant organizational level for conservation biology for much of its time has been the genetic and population level, the species level, whereas restoration's always been focused on the community and the ecosystem. And that conservation biology has a dominance of vertebrates, and whereas restoration has a dominance of plants. And a dominant conceptual theme has been population viability and population dynamics. And in restoration, it's assembly rules for communities and succession, and that restoration is highly experimental. We're always manipulating things in a restoration mode, and we're in conservation. We're often trying not to manipulate things, and it's often more descriptive and modeling, at least in an academic sense. Okay, so this is another paper from, or another figure from this paper, or I guess I've sort of redrafted it maybe. I don't, yeah, I think I redrafted this. Anyway, this idea is that if you think about the x-axis as time and the y-axis is habitat availability, that the blue line in the middle is some kind of trajectory, and that conservation is principally concerning itself with this idea of what to do as habitat is being lost and how to maximize the retention of biological diversity, whereas restoration, at least on a local sense, is thinking about rebuilding those environments. And so conservation and restoration are integrally linked at being at different points of this graph, and that they intersect quite a lot. And so that's I think an interesting concept. And just as a little bit of a diversion, this guy Daniel Press wrote this book called Saving Open Space, and he makes the argument that there are hot moments and hot places for open space action. So, take, for example, that the San Francisco, there's lots of social capital for protecting wild areas, but there's almost nothing left to protect. Everything that's left to be protected in San Francisco is protected. Whereas you go off to Modoc County, there's lots to accomplish. There's lots of land use, and you could be doing a better job for that for biodiversity. But there's not a lot of people, and those people don't have a lot of interest. And that somewhere in between those two extremes, you get these hot spots of open space protected. And for example, the East Bay in the 1960s, where there was a huge social effort to create this parks district, and that this has happened on a global scale. This is a paper by Volker Radeloff and others, looking at hot moments for biodiversity conservation, where in different places, North America and Australia, Southeast Asia, Africa, these happen at different times, but saying that there's relatively brief moments in time when there's a huge amount of protection after some time of social upheaval, and that this may be hitting some awareness or threshold period. And that this relates to what we might do in terms of that habitat loss, or prefer in terms of that habitat loss. And this is again a derivation of a figure from Truman's paper. On the left is what we as conservation biologists might want to do. We want to minimize the fragmentation, maximize the connectivity, or in the Marxan lingo, minimize the boundary length. Whereas in a restaurant, because we want to think about the green area as being protected and the white area as being lost to protections. Whereas a restoration ecologist might think about the checkerboard pattern as being a preferable one, saying, if we're going to rebuild the system, wouldn't we rather have the seed sources and the available populations all over the place and nearby? And so these are really different kinds of mindsets for how a conservation or restorationist might think. Okay, I'm going to stop this one here, and I'll finish up on the next one, and I promise less than 10 minutes.